I spend a lot of my time debunking anti-China propaganda because I've seen how bad it's become. Trust me, it was always bad because it's very easy to convince white people to hate China here. They think, oh, it's a country ran by Asian people. Of course it's filled. Of course they're authoritarian. And guys, that's what it is. They hate any country that's not theirs, that's not Western Europe, because they inherently don't believe that blacks, Asian, and other non-white people can run the country. And they would never admit it. I'm telling you, that's what it is.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. There's an enormous amount of xenophobia going on. I mean, you can see that because during the pandemic, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment, obviously, but that extended to Koreans, that extended to Japanese people, because Americans, they don't know the difference. They just see someone who looks Asian and then they assume that's the person who is making us sick, and that way that's really terrible. I mean, in terms of this data, 40% of Americans now see China as an enemy. I like to think of this, Americans, all Americans, right wing, left wing, everyone, they like to think, oh, I don't listen to the media, because the media tells us lies, right?
Yeah.
But then you ask these same people, what do you think of China? And they're like, I don't like China. Well, where did you hear that? In the media. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. They claim not to believe the media, but the media is exactly the vehicle that has made them hate China. So, I mean, it's really absolutely bizarre that the United States media is not trusted. And at the same time, all the people who watch it and don't trust it, or most of the people who watch it and don't trust it, end up thinking whatever is on there anyway. So it's really, really bizarre to me. I mean, a lot of people say things like, and I think this also goes back to your point about racism, is that they say, oh, I like Chinese people, I just don't like their government. Well, there's a study that Harvard has done that shows 95% of people in the PRC in China approve of their government, are satisfied, that's the word Harvard uses, with the Beijing government. So 95% of people love the central government and think that's doing a great job. And then you're going to be like, or someone's going to be like, oh, well, I'm protecting Chinese people from their government. I'm sorry. Americans don't even like the U.S. government at that rate.
Jason has a 13% approval rating.
Exactly. We need we Americans, we need to be like, wow, there's things we could be learning from the Chinese government. And at home, we need to fix our stuff. And that's really, I think, the reason that the media slanders China. They slander China because they don't want people looking at our own crap that's going wrong, and when we really need to be fixing stuff at home, not finding enemies abroad.
Well said. And there's nothing I find more cowardly, and I said it so many times, than people who live in the most violent empire in human history, where only 13% in your country support the ruling class, but you spend all your time hating countries that live thousands of miles away that you have no influence on. Those people are cowards. Because they inherently know they're not going to change shit here. So they're like, what's the point? And if you press them, you know how many people are pressed and that's initially their reaction? Oh, what's the point? If you press these people, that's essentially what they will go to. And that's why I don't fall for these charlatans. The China issue over the last 3 years, as I learned more about this, as I see this tie up, it was like, just like Palestine, a litmus test. I never fell for Tucker Carlson's bullshit because I'm like, no matter how good you sound on Ukraine and other issues, if you're missing this, you're used. And how many times have I warned you guys about this? Tucker will go off about China. He'd be good on Ukraine and other issues, but he will have Chinese derangement syndrome. This is why it's my litmus test. I don't take people seriously. The people who think you're independent minded, but you hate socialism and you can't explain why you hate socialism. You can't even define what authoritarianism is, which I do all the time. But you hate China, you call them authoritarian. People who just in America hate North Korea, for example, even though America killed 2 million Koreans. We committed a genocide against Korea, committed mass crimes against humanity, and we hate them. Like, what? Americans, they don't even ask themselves why they hate North Korea, for example. They just believe anything said by the West, stuff that is easily disputable, and they believe it because, of course, them filthy Asians do that kind of shit. You know what I mean? That's how Americans fall for this. Now, I'm going to show you guys this because I found this segment and found it interesting because I saw a clip from this interview that kind of went viral when they were talking about Taiwan. And I think this is what's GB News. Actually, maybe I should have looked this up before. What is GB News?
Great Britain, maybe?
Great Britain. I was thinking Australia. Yeah, it's Britain. So I know it's not American. But I want to show you guys this. I found this segment. I will listen to this. I was like, this is extremely fascinating. The propaganda people are told about China, how willfully ignorant people are, even in the news. So imagine how people who are not in the news are about China, which is why we have Jason Smith on, which is why I talked to the amazing professors at Bedbeat Media who teach in China, which is why I try to talk to people like Danny Haifong. We have Carl Dodd that's coming on here very soon.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I mean, I haven't been China. I want to go, but I got to talk to people who've been there. I mean, I don't want to mislead the audience. I'm passionate about what I hear about China, but I want to talk to people who've been there who can explain this kind of stuff as well, which is why we appreciate your expertise. I think this is going to be a fun segment to end on because I watched this like, man, the amount of, it is like a propaganda report in a way because the amount of what people are told about China is exactly why I'm not really surprised that 40% of Americans see China as an enemy. So let's get into this, and you can help me debunk this as well. If you want to interrupt anytime, feel free, because this segment is something else. Here's the title.
Anyone pursuing independence.
Here's the title. China on the march. Xi Jinping sets date to seize Taiwan. So let's listen to what they had to say.
For Taiwan will be crushed to pieces and face destruction. The threat comes just a week after China conducted large-scale military drills around Taiwan in what it called punishment for so-called separatist acts. So, how worried should we be about a potential war? And would the US get involved in defense of Taiwan? We'll be shortly speaking via video link to Nigel Inkster, who is Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and China at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And here in the studio, I'm joined by geopolitics expert, Dr. Roger Giewolb. Welcome to the show.
Oh, this guy's hilarious. Wait till you hear from this guy. This guy is hilarious.
Roger, I want to come to you first about this. This is absolutely fascinating, but there are a lot of misunderstandings about what's going on in China and Taiwan and the tensions that are occurring there. So firstly, can I ask you about this? A lot of people perceive it to be the case that if there is an escalation, that the US is obliged to intervene. Is that correct?
No, only in the case of an unprovoked attack. If they're messing around, if they're being aggressive, if they're poking the US, it's very woolly. They're not committed to particularly do anything. The whole China situation is kind of woolly in a strange sort of a way. It is perceived that China's the bad guy. It's a Russia-Ukraine situation, but that's not actually the case because there are really three factors in play here as I see. The first one is the one China policy, which says Taiwan is part of China. They belong together to the same country. Now, the US and us here accept the one China policy. And the language is also woolly, Andrew. It says we acknowledge but don't approve.
Okay.
So we have all these relationships with Taiwan and support and arms and trade and a million, but it's all under the table. It's under the radar. It's not official because they're not a state and they're not recognized.
I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear that.
So
a lot of people would be surprised to hear that, Jason, because I was actually shocked because this is one of the few times that you know that this is Britain. In the United States, you would never, ever hear that explanation on Morning Joe.
But you know what's really what's really strange is President Truman. He actually came out in a speech and talked about the one China policy publicly from the White House on national television, and it's recorded. People replay this when they get into arguments online and social media platforms and so forth. So since then, the United States has been like trying to put it under the radar more and more for media purposes, to try to wield more power in Asia. But yeah, there's a one China policy that's accepted by most countries around the world. Actually, there's only like 4 or 5 countries left in the entire world that don't accept the one China policy officially. The United States does, the United Nations does, and like 196 countries around the world also accept the one China policy.
Yeah, and there's so many Americans that don't know it. Like, you know how many times like people will get mad, like they probably trolls, but there are a lot of like legit right wingers. Whenever I say Taiwan and China, they're like, no, it's not. You're repeating Chinese propaganda. What are you talking about? Your
this is U.S., yeah.
No, and I know that may surprise you, but there's legitimately Americans that will argue that point to you. If you made that's why this commentator, he was like, I think a lot of people were surprised to hear you say that. Because they would in America. They don't, this explanation you would never hear, but don't get twisted. This guy here, this is the only rational thing he's about to say on this panel. And it's actually interesting because I was expecting this guy to be good throughout the entire video. After this, I'm like, oh, I guess this guy is here to like be the rational guy. He's not really. And it's interesting that he knows about the one China policy, and then his comments that come afterwards. So that part was good from him, but bro, he's hilarious because he's very hard to get a read on. He knows this stuff, but he also, at the same time, and you guys will know more what I'm talking about as we watch the video, he also buys into a lot of the Western neocon bullshit too. So let's watch it. Feel free to interrupt if you have any comments, but let's get into it.
And the language is also woolly, Andrew. It says we acknowledge but don't approve.
Okay.
So we have all these relationships with Taiwan and support and arms and trade and a million, but it's all under the table. It's under the radar. It's not official because they're not a state and they're not recognized.
I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear that.
So the thing that keeps it safe, I think, point number one, is that China can take comfort that they aren't the world's bad guy. They aren't Putin. They aren't Russia invading Ukraine.
Yes.
They're claiming what everybody else says. You want to say it's your country? Okay.
Yeah, see, there's a little bit of shit lib in this guy. Like, he got put in the random syndrome. He's one of those people like, man, why are we so focused on China, man? We should be focused on Russia and destabilizing Europe instead. But anyway, let's listen a little bit more.
Hey, it's your country.
But a lot of people are interpreting, for instance, Xi Jinping meeting with Putin the other week as being a kind, that this is a kind of new axis of evil, so that's sort of developed.
Yeah, well, they are going to become more aggressive because of the second and third factors. I think the second factor is, well, three factors really. One is this new president, which I've mentioned. So, he is not the one they would have liked who is in favor of unification. So they're going to show their muscle. The third factor is Joe Biden, who they perceive, surprise, surprise, is rather weak. And his recent, in the last week or so, way in which he's dealt with his support for Israel in a kind of a wishy-washy way, I think they're going to take note of and realize they can push.
I told you guys, this man had one rational take this entire show. He said that Biden has been wishy-washy on Israel as he supplied hundreds of millions, billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel, provided diplomatic cover. And I covered this before. The Biden administration literally had employees that put reports together that would have exposed Israeli war crimes, and the Biden administration fired them as a result of putting those reports together.
There are also several members of the White House have stepped down and chosen to leave the White House because they could no longer support, these unethical acts.
Yeah, and I can't wait till we hear more about those from the whistleblowers, because that's how we got that nugget that I will never let liberals forget. One of the people who has blown the whistle, who I showed you guys on our last show, explained how he put together a report. Remember, the Biden administration was saying they have no evidence that Israel committed war crimes. And then the staffers was like, hey, actually, boss, we actually do have a compilation of war crimes that Israel put together. And Biden was like, you're fired. Get him out of here.
Wow.
And they literally doing a media tour. Ali Veshi's probably going to be fired for interviewing them in a bit. But I'm never going to let people forget about that. But let's watch. We're not going to watch the whole thing. Let's watch a little bit more. You guys see that this guy came out strong and bring up the one China policy. But man, he gets more unhinged as you watch this video, bro. I'll go back a little bit. Let's continue.
Prize is rather weak. And his recent, in the last week or so, way in which he's dealt with his support for Israel in a kind of a wishy-washy way, I think they're going to take note of and realize they can push a bit further.
Very interesting. We're going to come back to that point, I think, about the American situation. But I just want to bring in Nigel Inkster at this point. Nigel, can I ask you about these recent military drills? Of course, the last time we saw this was when Nancy Pelosi was over there in November of 2022. Is this simply a show of muscle, as Rogers says? Or is there something more sinister at play here?
It is a show of muscle. It's actually a lot of things. It is a show of muscle. It's a show of disapproval for the new president, William Lai, whose inaugural address didn't say anything new, but said some things in a way that China found particularly offensive. I think it's worth bearing in mind that between the election of Lai in January this year and now, China's military activity in the Taiwan Straits has been relatively restrained and limited up until this point. The other purposes of the exercises are deterrence, to try to convince potential actors like the United States that they can't hope to intervene effectively in the event of China deciding to invade. It's also about continuing to impose psychological pressure on Taiwan and attrition on Taiwan's armed forces, who have to send up their aging fleet of F-16 fighters every time these incursions take place. This imposes a significant toll on them. And of course, it's also part of Chinese military efforts to develop the capabilities and to exercise the capabilities that they would need if they're going to take Taiwan.
Very interesting. I just want to come back to Roger about this, because there are a number of reasons why the Chinese might want to have a presence there. There's the oil resources, of course, in the South China Seas, but there's also this question of superconductors.
This last part I definitely want to hear, so we play this part and we begin to wrap this part up. But you guys see the theme. He ended with this: is why China want to take Taiwan. This is what they want to put this impression on their audiences, to be afraid that China is the aggressor. Remember what he mentioned there. He mentioned Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan. Do you guys remember that? And this was another example of restraint shown by China, Russia, and Iran, because in order to prevent this from happening, China was, just like Russia does a lot of times, saying a lot of bluster. They were saying, this is the red line. You guys better not say Nancy Pelosi. If you guys do, it's fucking over. They was going hard to draw these red lines. And what Nancy Pelosi and these psychopaths did, despite all the warnings from China, was to send Nancy Pelosi over there anyway. And then China's like, these motherfuckers crazy. Just like Russia. Had drawn all these red lines and the Western Cross is just.
Could you imagine?
Go ahead, Jason. Go ahead.
I mean, your example of Long Island before, but could you imagine that if China was trying to arm Hawaii and sent political delegations to Hawaii, which were representing China's dialogue with Hawaii as though Hawaii were trying to become an independent nation, the United States wouldn't just bluster. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I think China, Russia, and Iran have been showing amazing restraint, because based on what I've been hearing, China they're like, this is the red line. You guys be met with massive escalation if you guys. Then they did it, and then they just did some pussy military drills. And I'm not trying to be mean to China, because I get it. They had nothing else they can do. They were just flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that the United States and the West keep pushing, just like Russia. They just can't believe that. Any other crazy, I'll put it like this: any state ran by a Western leader, like a George Bush, a Henry Kissinger type, it would have been war by now. But we're gonna wrap up here very soon. I just want to hear this last part from him, because this guy goes crazy throughout the most of the segment. Let's start from here.
Of course, in the South China Seas, but there's also this question of superconductors. 70% of the world's superconductors are in Taiwan. This actually has huge ramifications if China were to seize those factories, would it not?
I
fast forward a little bit too much there, but there's the quiet part out loud. And I was watching this like, do you guys just admit the real reason you guys want to go to war with China here? And yes, they essentially admit it here. Let's continue.
Yeah, I was just going to come on to that.
Actually, I'll play the question again, because I cut off a little bit at the beginning, because I saw this question. Now I want to make sure I play this part last, where they just essentially admit the real reason why the West.
Very interesting. I just want to come back to Roger about this, because there are a number of reasons why the Chinese might want to have a presence there. There's the oil resources, of course, in the South China Seas, but there's also this question of superconductors. 70% of the world's superconductors are in Taiwan. This actually has huge ramifications if China were to seize those factories, would it not?
Well, I was just going to come on to that, and for the benefit of our viewers and our audience, I mean, why are we all sitting here talking about China and Taiwan? It's miles away. It's two countries. It's not us. We got enough of our troubles here. Well, the reason why is chips and superconductors, because if those fell into the wrong hands or were used in the wrong way, that would be the end of the world commerce.
They just saying it, Jason. As they try to pretend it's about anything else, they say it's about democracy. We gotta pretend. They just admitting that it's about the fucking chips. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I think it's also really interesting, because even though Taiwan does produce some chips that are not able to be produced by China's mainland, the vast majority of microprocessors that are needed to, like, work in your computer or even military equipment can already be made by China's mainland. The very, very tiny processors that are being produced in Taiwan actually have very few applications, because if you're going to build a missile, if everything's banging around in there while it's traveling, you actually don't want these super tiny processors. So yes, Taiwan does have the ability to produce smaller microchips that might be able to use in AI and stuff, but very soon, and I think this is going to shock people, within 2 or 3 years, China's mainland will already be able to produce most of those at scale anyway. And China's also, another thing, trying to leapfrog over that into the next technologies by leaving these kinds of materials and switching over to things like gold, for example, which can be folded at an atomic level like origami. So there's actually what's going to happen to the US narrative. I don't think it's just about semiconductors. This is also about the way that US is trying to contain China in its island chain system. So after the semiconductor issue goes away and China's mainland can do all of that in a few years, the US is going to have to change its narrative why it's trying to aggravate China, because clearly the United States wants to keep China aggravated, maybe wants some kind of conflict so that it can maybe weaken it versus its neighbors in the region and so forth. So eventually I think the semiconductor things is actually going to go away, and then they're going to say it's for a different reason, that they're protecting the democracy.
I actually didn't think about it like that. So what you're saying, that the semiconductor and the chip's not even that big of a deal, it's almost like the West is just using it as an excuse.
It is a big deal, but it's only a big deal in the short term. In a few years, it's not going to matter because China will have already innovated past all of that stuff. China has the most STEM majors in the world. Most of the really advanced, proficient scientists of Chinese descent in the United States are returning to China. So the best universities, according to Nature magazine, nature.com, are in China. The STEM universities, not philosophy and stuff like that, but science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the best universities for that are now in China's mainland. So they're going to be innovating past the ability of Taiwan's factories that are making those semiconductors, and be able to make the same thing or better very, very, very soon.
Yeah, well said. And I appreciate your time today, Jason. I learned a lot. We definitely gonna have you back on because I'm very curious about China, and you helped me. You helped me a lot with my framing today, because China is such a massive country. I'm trying to learn as much as I can. I'm very impressed, and I appreciate your expertise. We definitely got to have you back on again. But one thing I want to share with you guys, because all these missteps by the United States is only helping China increase their influence, increasing the rise of BRICS. So I want to ask you about de-dollarization. I don't want to make sure I don't forget about this. But before I get to that, you have China, because of these missteps, that are able to win over other countries diplomatically. Other countries are just more willing to do business with China because they're not going to give them a lecture. And this is what China is like going around telling people, like, yo, we're not just talking shit, man. We just here to lay out the receipts. We're going to explain the reality of the situation is that you rather have us at the head hegemon, because have you guys seen the death and destruction of the previous hegemon? So I saw this video earlier. I just want an excuse to play, if I'm gonna be honest. But let's play it, and then we can begin to wrap up, Jason. Here's the headline. China, or the tweet. China publicly states that America is the biggest source of world chaos. Where's the lie? And the greatest threat to international stability. Where's the lie?
事实证明，美国才是国际秩序的最大烂源，全球治理进程的最大绊脚石，地区和平稳定的最大挑战。对美方双标来说，规则秩序是霸权话术，合着用，不合则弃，用来管别人，从不管自己，一贯是唯我独尊，我行我素。从阿富汗到伊拉克，从乌克兰到加沙，都是美方利己商标制造的危机冲突。
If you was only listening, you didn't hear what they said. They were essentially just cooking the United States, calling them out for their hypocrisy. So while we'll wrap up with, because I have 1,000 things to show, we just gotta say it another time. Is what are your thoughts on China calling out the West hypocrisy and the push for de-dollarization and BRICS. I just saw Brazil join the Belt and Road Initiative. I saw something. I saw another country that was signed up to join. But I got to pull the receipt up. But what are your thoughts about the rise of BRICS, China's role on the international stage, and the push for de-dollarization? Let's wrap up with that.
Well, the person who wrote the book De-Dollarization, his name is Gal Luft. He's someone I've interviewed, and I'm actually not convinced. I know a lot of economists, and I've interviewed a lot of economists. I'm not sure that the dollar is just going to come down at some point. It's not perfectly clear, and there's no model for what that would look like because the United States derivatives market was like hundreds of trillions of dollars and like derivatives. Who knows what it would look like if there were such a thing? China absolutely does want to move away from the dollar, not because it's trying to cripple the United States, but because the United States uses the dollar as a weapon. Look at what the United States did to Russia. Countries around the world are starting to sell off their treasuries. Belgium is selling off its treasuries. Saudi Arabia is selling off its treasuries. Japan is selling off some of its treasuries for a different reason. China is selling off some of its treasuries and buying gold. So it's not that everyone's like, we want to destroy the United States by de-dollarizing, but that there's a diversification, a process of multipolarity where countries around the world are looking to hold other assets. Because if the United States, the United States is the king of sanctions. It sanctions and it seizes assets and dollars all over the world from countries whenever it likes at will. It did this to Iraq. It's doing this to Russia. It's doing this to individuals all over the world. So people and nations are scared because if it's held in dollars, then maybe the United States can seize that. Or if it's treasuries, the United States can seize that, or they can sanction people, countries, and individuals. So in corporations. So there's a move away from the dollar, not to try to cripple the dollar, to cripple the United States, but to hold things that are maybe of better value, like a bread basket of currency where they have all kinds of different currencies, or maybe gold, or maybe silver, or maybe BRICS is creating a kind of currency, and that it will be really interesting to see. Is there going to be an inflection point where it hurts the U.S. economy? That's you'd have to ask a real economist, not me.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective. We definitely gotta have you on back again. I just always like to ask, especially people in China, what they think about it, how real it is. There are a lot of panic. I'm panicking. I got family that live here. But anyway, I think it's a very important topic and a lot of very important stuff. We didn't get to everything I want to talk about, but I think it was a great conversation overall. I appreciate your
nice
time,
meeting
Jason.
you.
Any last plugs? Any last thing you want to shout out? Definitely great being in conversation with you finally, Jason.
Well, instead of plugging myself, I'll just say this. I want Americans and Chinese people to get along. It matters a lot to me. If you guys are not sure what China is like, sometimes fans of socialist MMA, I would really encourage you to just come to China. Come to China for a week or two or a year if you can. Come here to work as a teacher or something.
I want to
come to China. Yeah, see it for yourself. You don't take my word for it. They used to say that on Reading Rainbow, right? But don't take my word for it. So instead of opening a book, take a look. Come over to China and take a look.